Okay, so that concludes the first part of the presentation, which was going over the results of the survey. The second part of the presentation, supporting communication skills for individuals with HIVEP2, I'm going to be talking mostly about augmentative and alternative communication strategies, or AAC, since it sounds like many of the children in this group have benefited or could benefit from using AAC strategies. So brief overview of what I'll talk about. The first is what is AAC, and I think many of you have probably heard the term before and might be surprised to hear that it encompasses, more than just speech generating devices or pictures. For those of you who are interested in pursuing some additional AAC strategies for their child, I will talk about how to go about doing that through the assessment process. And last, I'm going to be answering some questions. So the way that I've put it in the presentation is in the format of frequently asked questions. These are questions that I'm probably asked by parents the most often, which may or may not also apply to your kids. And I also know that parents had submitted some questions in advance of this presentation, and I did try to include some of those in this format in a more general way. However, if there are specific questions that I'm not able to address during this presentation, I certainly want to leave time for parents to ask those at the end as well. Okay, so what is AAC? I think most of you can recognize this person. This is, of course, Stephen Hawking, the world-famous physicist from the UK. He has ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease, and so for a number of years now has had to rely on using a speech-generating device. So I think when a lot of people picture AAC, this is the type of AAC they think of. They think of some type of a high-tech speech-generating device with a kind of robotic sounding voice to it. And that is a type of AAC, but AAC is much broader than that. So it refers to all tools and strategies that are used to supplement or replace speech when it's not sufficient to meet a person's daily needs. And I wanted to highlight a few parts of that definition. So first, the tools and strategies part. So AAC, yes, it refers to tools, things like devices or pictures, but it also refers to strategies, so the way that people can communicate more efficiently and effectively. And then the second part of the definition I want to point out is that AAC can be used both to supplement as well as replace speech. So I think some people, when they think of AAC, they think it might only be helpful for individuals who are nonverbal. But that's just not the case. And I would actually hazard to guess that most individuals who use AAC actually do have some speech. The underlying concern, though, is that the speech isn't sufficient to meet all of that person's needs. Maybe their speech is difficult to understand. Maybe they just don't have enough words to adequately convey their thoughts. And so there are a lot of individuals out there, a lot of children out there who might benefit from AAC who aren't currently using it. So what kinds of children could benefit from AAC? The short person is there really is no typical user. There's a really wide range of individuals who benefit from it, from intellectual disability, autism spectrum disorder, to kids who have motor difficulties. So cerebral palsy, motor speech impairments, kids whose speech is highly unintelligible, and then individuals who also have craniofacial differences. So things like cleft palate can be very hard to understand. So in general, anyone who can't rely on speech alone to meet their needs. It's a very wide group. AAC can be divided very generally into two fields. The first is unaided strategies. These are things that don't require any excess tools. So the user uses his or her own body to convey the message. It includes facial expression, vocalizations, gestures, and sign language. And I think as part of the survey, many of you mentioned that your children are currently using gestures well, and that's great. That would actually be considered AAC because it's supplementing speech. Sign language too, I think 3 out of the 5 children also reported using some sign language. And then the other broad category is aided AAC. Aided meaning some type of a tool is necessary to convey the message. Aided AAC falls somewhere on a continuum from low-tech to high-tech. Low-tech could be things like pencil and paper, alphabet boards, pictures, photographs. Both PECS and ImPod would be considered low-tech strategies. And then as you kind of move up the continuum, you have mid-tech devices. These can be things like single-message voice output devices like a Big Mac, fixed display speech generating devices like a GoTalk, or high-tech devices. Now these can be dedicated devices or they can be non-dedicated tablet-based devices such as the iPad. So I'm going to go over 5 different types of AAC. This is certainly not a comprehensive list. There's many more strategies than this out there, but in my experience, these are probably the most commonly used strategies. The first is sign language. I think the first thing, an important thing to keep in mind, is that American Sign Language ASL is a real language. And what I mean by that is, there's thousands of words in sign language. These can be combined in really an infinite number of ways. There's generative grammar rules that are involved. And so, individuals can have entire conversations using ASL the same way that we would use spoken English. Before about 1990 or the early 90s, it was actually the most common AAC strategy used for people who have autism or intellectual disability. I'd say starting in the 90s, things like PECS and then speech generating devices began to become much more popular. But traditionally, for individuals who are minimally verbal, sign language was the AAC strategy to use. Some researchers and some teachers would argue today that it's still easier for certain individuals, particularly with intellectual disability, to learn signs versus picture selection. Although in my own experience, I would say, some children respond better to one and some respond better to the other. And then sign language is oftentimes most effective when it's used in what's called a total communication approach. And that's where you use both sign and speech simultaneously to communicate with the child. There's been research studies showing that this actually aids the child's comprehension of speech as well as their ability to produce it. So just like any type of a strategy, there are going to be some pros and cons. The pros for sign language, the first is big in that it's a true language, meaning that there's an unlimited generative vocabulary. It's also portable. You could say it's infinitely portable in that a person always has access to his or her hands. It's inexpensive. So unlike equipment that sometimes costs thousands of dollars, most people can learn sign language by taking a basic class. There are books, there are videos out there that families can learn on their own. And then the last is that it's a relatively fast rate of communication. So individuals who become proficient with sign language really can communicate just about as fast as speaking individuals. The negative aspects of sign language, I think the first one is probably the biggest one, and that's not all communication partners, and actually most communication partners probably will not understand a child's signs. This is less of an issue at the early ages when children are mostly coming into contact with their own family members, teachers, therapists who do understand sign. But as children become older, it could become more of a problem. So most people in the community are not going to understand sign language, and so they're going to have to rely on people to interpret for them. There are a lot of learning demands that are placed on the communication partners to learn sign language. And one thing that's important too to keep in mind is that the family members and the therapist will always have to be one step ahead of the child. So children learn from imitation and from modeling most of the time, and so they have to see new signs actually modeled for them in order to learn new signs, otherwise their language growth is going to plateau. And lastly, for many kids, sign language just might not be a possibility if there are significant motor impairments. PECS is another very commonly used strategy. PECS stands for the Picture Exchange Communication System, and it's actually based on a training protocol from the mid-'80s based on the principles of applied behavior analysis. And I would say at least half the time when I hear families or schools saying that their child is using PECS, they really just mean that their child is using pictures to make choices. And I think that's erroneous much of the time. So PECS really does refer to a very specific training protocol. It doesn't just mean using pictures to make choices. In the true PECS protocol, there are 6 different training phases. The first phase is really just teaching a child how to communicate. And that might sound very obvious, but for many children, particularly children with autism, that's not that obvious. Kids do have to learn that communication is an exchange and that it always happens between at least 2 people. That in the first phase of PECS is taught very explicitly. Basically what happens is the child sees something that they want, they reach for the item because that's the child's natural response, and then that reaching behavior is shaped into an exchange. The second phase of PECS, the child still has access to just one picture at a time, but then they have to learn, okay, sometimes the person in front of me has what I want, sometimes I might have to walk across the room and find the person who can get the thing that I want, and so it really teaches persistence. It's not until phase 3 of PECS that a child has access to more than one picture at a time. That's called picture discrimination, and I think commonly most people refer to that as choice making. So when I see PECS fail, most of the time it's because I see people skipping right to phase 3, where they're giving a child access to multiple pictures and asking them to make a choice. Many kids aren't ready for that yet, and so they're not going to learn how to do that functionally. The last 3 phases of PECS teach children to do things more than just request. So things like actually putting words together to form a sentence, answer questions, and comment. The pros of PECS, number one, is that it's durable. So unlike a high-tech device that can break if you drop it, PECS is made out of inexpensive paper that's usually laminated and Velcro, and so it's pretty hardy. If a child does, flush a picture down the toilet or drop it out of the car, it's fairly inexpensive to replace. It's also easy to understand the message. So this is in contrast to something like sign language, where you need to be trained to understand what a sign means. I think most adults, if they were handed a picture of a cookie by a child, they would understand that that child is requesting a cookie. There's also research support, quite a bit of research support for kids who have autism as well as other developmental disorders in supporting the use of PECS for basic communication. Some negative aspects is that vocabulary and language complexity are going to be constrained. So PECS is really great for teaching requesting. It's not really great for teaching how to combine words in a novel way, in a grammatical way. Secondly, there's no voice output. Certain situations you might want voice output to get someone's attention or to communicate from a distance. There's going to be a slower rate of communication. So, as the child gets better at using PECS, ironically, they're actually going to get slower at using PECS. They're going to have access to more and more pictures. It's going to take longer to find what they want, and it becomes more cumbersome. It's harder for them to carry around all those pictures with them throughout the day. POD is the next low-tech system I'll be talking about. It stands for the Pragmatic Organization Dynamic Display, and this is the system that Marissa was mentioning that her son is using successfully right now. This strategy was developed around the same time of PECS, actually, in the 90s in Australia by Gail Porter, and at the time it was really designed mainly for children with cerebral palsy who lived in residential or special schools. I'd say just in the last maybe 5 years, POD has really taken off in the United States and become a lot more popular, but it has been around, especially in Australia, for quite some time. It's a multi-level low-tech system involving what they call partner-assisted navigation. What partner-assisted navigation means basically is the child points to a picture in the book, and then the adult then flips the page to new vocabulary based on their selection. So for example, maybe the child points to something is wrong, and then the adult would then flip to the vocabulary where they could tell you what's wrong. So, my head hurts or my stomach hurts. It's based on the principle of aided language stimulation, which basically means that children learn best through modeling. And so the primary teaching principle of POD is that the adults in their environment will actually be using the POD system to model good communication skills. The pros of POD are that it encourages communication for a variety of pragmatic purposes. So I mentioned with PECS, especially the early stages, you're really focusing on requesting almost exclusively. With POD, the child is able to request, but they're also able to comment, to ask questions, to protest. We all communicate for different purposes, and POD really supports that. It also grows with the child over time. I think Marissa mentioned that her son is using a book with 12 items on a page. But if I go back real quick to this slide, you can see that it becomes a lot more complex over time, where you can actually have access to dozens of things per page. There's a large amount of preset vocabulary, including core words. Core words are those little function words that actually make up the majority of speech, so things like the and for and to. And then it can be adapted for children with severe motor impairments. So some children might have difficulty with a true touchscreen device because they lack the precision and finger control. POD, if you kind of get in the ballpark, your partner can help you and figure out what you're trying to say. Some negative things about POD are that it will always require adult assistance. So when a child does make a selection, it does require that their partner flips to the page that they want. Again, this isn't an issue when kids are younger and most of the people who they're talking to are adults or family members. But as children are older, it will require an adult to be there with them as they communicate, for instance, with peers. It doesn't have voice output like the other strategies. There are certain situations when you might want that. It's a slower rate of communication, again, because you have to touch the picture and then wait for the adult to go to the next page that you want. At this point, there really isn't a whole lot of research evidence on its efficacy. And I want to stress that doesn't mean that it doesn't work for some kids. I've certainly seen it in practice work very well for certain kids, but I do think it's important that more research is done to try to figure out which kids are going to benefit best from the strategy and how to implement it effectively. And then lastly, in my own experience, again, there's not research on this, but in my own experience, I find that POD doesn't work as well for kids who have difficulty paying attention to others or have difficulty modeling. Again, because the teaching strategy is mainly modeling and aided language stimulation. If a child doesn't really take to modeling, if they need something a little bit more directive, sometimes POD can be challenging.
Marissa?
Sure.
I just wanted to add too, these are all the low-tech options for POD, and there's actually 2 high-tech options. You can use POD on an iPad through the Compass app, and then POD can actually also transfer into a speech-generating device through Tobii Dynavox.
Thank you. Yes, that's true. And those are recent developments just within the last year or two that they've really brought that to speech generating devices. So that has been helpful. Kids who are used to the low-tech system, but who are ready to transition to a high-tech system, it certainly provides an avenue to do that.
Yeah.
Thank you for adding that. The next type of device I'm going to talk about is a high-tech device, fixed display speech generating devices. Now, I have a few examples down here. These vary quite widely in terms of specifications, complexity, and price. So all the way on the left, you see what's called a Big Mac device. And that's basically where you record a single message, the child hits the button, and then it plays back the message. These can also go up to, like the Go Talk type of devices, touch tech, things like that, that might have dozens of messages per page. They do get more complex than that. The pros are that they're relatively cheap. When you compare them to high-tech, tablet-based devices, these are usually $100 or several $100s versus several $1,000s in the high-tech devices. They're durable, so like touchscreen devices, obviously, if you throw it, the screen could break and shatter. These devices are really used to taking some wear and tear, so you can usually drop them. I've had kids actually slam tables on them, and they don't break very easily, so that's one benefit to them. They're relatively easy to program and use, and then they do have voice output. So this is an option for a child who would require voice output for some situations, but might not be ready for a dynamic display device. The cons, and the first one's a big one, is that vocabulary capacity is very limited. So I very rarely recommend a fixed display SGD as an individual's primary communication strategy. I will sometimes recommend it as a supplement for something else, just to give the child access to voice output. But in general, when you give a child a fixed display device, you're only giving them access to a very small set of messages that they can use at any one time. Typically, they do require adult assistance to switch out overlays. So let's say you give a child access to snack vocabulary during snack. When that child then transitions to circle time, an adult has to be there to switch out and give them access to new vocabulary. So it does kind of limit independent communication. Dynamic display SGDs are high-tech devices, usually tablets nowadays, almost exclusively tablets nowadays, and these change screens when activated, thereby introducing new vocabulary. I think pretty much everyone there either has or has at some point used iPads or tablets or smartphones, and so they're generally familiar with what it means to have a dynamic display device. On these devices, vocabulary is usually represented by photographs, pictures, words, or both. And then vocabulary can be arranged several different ways, most commonly by grid displays, and you can see that down on the bottom left-hand side. That's a typical grid display. Another way vocabulary can be arranged is by what's called visual scene display, and that's an example of that is on the right down there. Visual scene display is usually where you take a photograph of a single thing, maybe it's a room, it could be a tray of food, and then vocabulary is embedded within the familiar scene. There's some research that indicates that young children or children who are functioning at those earliest stages of communication oftentimes understand intuitively vocabulary in a visual scene display a little bit better than a grid display. And I think when we think of speech generating devices nowadays, I think many people first think of off-the-shelf tablet technology like the iPad or like the Samsung Galaxy. I'd say most of the kids out there who are using SGDs do use tablet-based devices, but there's still also quite a few dedicated devices that are out there. The way that these things are the same is that they both have large storage capacity, they both support language growth, and nowadays they really both have quite high quality voice output. So there aren't many devices nowadays that sound like Stephen Hawking's device with the kind of computerized voice output. They're usually quite realistic nowadays. The biggest difference between the two and you can kind of see that difference in the name itself, is that a dedicated device is really used only for communication. It is dedicated for that purpose, whereas tablet-based devices can be used for many different purposes. Now, there are good things and bad things about that. You know, the good thing about it is that an individual might be able to use their tablet-based device to write emails, to interact with social media, to do other things in their environment rather than just communicate. The bad thing, or the drawback to that, is that sometimes when children are used to using a tablet for doing things like watching videos or playing games, it's really difficult for them to transition into seeing that device as a communication device and not as a toy. So what I oftentimes recommend for the clients that I see is if they already have an iPad and they're used to using it for playing, that perhaps they get a second tablet-based device, and then that tablet is dedicated for communication purposes. Another difference is with durability. So dedicated devices are usually more durable than off-the-shelf technology. Of course, you can purchase things like protective covers and cases that can make tablet-based devices more durable, but the ones that are dedicated typically right off the shelf are going to be more durable. They also have better customer support. So most of the time when you go through a durable medical equipment company to purchase the device, if something were to happen to the device, you can send it back to the company. They'll send you a loaner device in the interim, and then they'll fix it and send it back as part of the warranty. Those of you who have an iPad know that, if your child throws the iPad and breaks the screen, you can't take it back to the Apple store to get a refund or to get a loaner device while it's being fixed. Dedicated devices, because they can only be used for communication, are oftentimes covered by insurance. Tablet-based devices, if they're off the shelf, are typically, although there are some instances when you can get insurance, but in general, they're not covered by insurance. Dedicated devices are often very expensive, whereas tablets, iPads are not cheap, but in general, they're less expensive than if you are paying out of pocket for the dedicated device. And then the other difference is that there are variable sizes with dedicated devices, whereas in general, tablets are quite lightweight and portable. So some of you might be thinking that one or two of these strategies may work well for your child, and you're wondering how to go about getting something like that. The first thing that you would want to do is have a comprehensive assessment. These assessments are typically conducted by the speech pathologist, although the speech pathologist is going to gather information from a wide range of sources. So from the child's family, their teachers, therapists, doctors. If your child has significant motor impairment, you definitely want to get the input of that child's OT or PT when it comes to things like seating and positioning and access. The speech therapist is going to review the child's strengths and needs. They're going to do some testing with the child. Some of this could be standardized, especially if the child's able to do things like point to a picture. However, much of the testing is going to be non-standardized, because when I do these types of assessments, I don't really care about a standard score. What I care about is what is the child able to do and what type of supports does the child need in order to be successful. The speech therapist is going to identify situations with the help of the parent where current communication is not cutting it. So whatever strategies they're using now, what are those situations when it's not sufficient to meet the child's needs? And then what you're going to do is identify solutions to meet the child's needs in those situations based on a principle called feature mapping. And that's where you take the child's strengths and their needs, and then you map that onto certain features of devices or onto strategies to figure out what's going to work best for the child. So throughout this process, the rule of thumb is that you fit the AAC system to the child, you don't fit the child to the AAC system. And I think that's important. Sometimes what happens is families who are very well-intentioned, or school teams, will go out and, for instance, purchase an iPad for a child, and then they might come to the speech therapist and say, how do I get my child to use this effectively? And that's really not best practice, because what we want to do is say, well, what does the child need right now? What are their strengths and weaknesses? And it could be that an iPad is the best tool, but it could be that something else is as well. So you always want to look at the child first. The second part to this are doing device trials, and that's where you actually trial several different devices and strategies over time. So you might use device 1 week, device 2 the second week, and then you actually take data about how well each thing works before you settle on a system that best fits the child's needs. Now, you're probably thinking a lot of these devices are expensive. How do we go about getting several things to trial over time? I know in Pennsylvania we have lending libraries in every county, and I'm pretty sure throughout the United States there are assistive technology resource centers. Most states do have some type of funding available for lending libraries through the Tech Act. So I've included a website here, at least in the United States, that should outline where the lending libraries are and how they're funded in each state. At that point, when you find funding, if you want to go through private insurance or Medicaid, you're going to need to submit the AAC evaluation, including that device trial data to the insurance plan. Insurance typically wants a doctor's prescription or a letter of medical necessity. If you're going through insurance, what I would recommend doing is contacting the manufacturer of the device that you want. And most of those manufacturers have dedicated funding departments that can walk you through that process. The second avenue of funding for some children could be the school district. So if in the IEP it's written that a child needs a specific device and software in order to meet their educational needs, then the school district by law really should provide funding for that device. In practice, it does not always work this way. In my own experience, most districts do not want to write specific technology into the IEP for this reason, because then they know that they would have to pay for those things. So they tend to keep it more general. But I oftentimes tell families that the first thing that you should do is to ask your school district, because it's possible you could get something funded through the district. You can also look into low interest loans or national support organizations. Two that I know of off the top of my head are Autism Speaks and the Childhood Apraxia of Speech Association of North America, or CCC-SLP. They both have grant funding opportunities for families. And then lastly, you can look into local community service or charitable organizations, things like Kiwanis Club, Lions Club, etc. So some frequently asked questions. The first is, will using AAC prevent my child from learning how to talk? This is the question I'm probably asked more than anything else. So I'm happy to report that there's been quite a bit of research in this area, and it shows that introducing AAC will not keep your child from learning how to talk. I always tell parents, if your child's going to talk, they will. You know, introducing these strategies won't prevent it. There's actually been some preliminary evidence that certain children might have an increase in verbal speech after the introduction of AAC. So this shouldn't be the goal of introducing AAC, but in some situations, you actually might see an increase in verbal speech. Another question I'm oftentimes asked is, how can children with significant physical disabilities access an AAC device? And I again put on here Stephen Hawking. If you think of Stephen Hawking, he has very limited use of his limbs. He's in a wheelchair throughout the day, and yet he's able to access a device. So technology is really amazing. And just in the last 5 years, there have been leaps and bounds and improvements for access strategies. We have eye gaze devices for kids who can use their eyes. We have switches, which can be activated by simply blinking an eye or twitching a chin. So even children with the most severe physical handicaps should be able to access an AAC device. Another question I'm oftentimes asked for many of my kids who are nonverbal or minimally verbal is whether or not their child has apraxia. Childhood apraxia of speech is something many of you may have heard of before. It's thought to be a disorder of motor planning and programming. The biggest thing to keep in mind is that when a child is minimally verbal, it's really not possible to reliably diagnose it. In order to reliably diagnose apraxia, you need to have a nice, robust speech sample, because what you need to do is analyze the way that a child is mispronouncing things. I'm sorry, I'm having difficulty with that word. However, I do know that that was a question that some parents had, so I wanted to provide some additional apraxia resources. There's actually a Simon's VIP webinar that I did a couple of years ago on speech sound disorders, and that included apraxia. I've included the link there. And then there's a really wonderful organization and website called CCC-SLP, which is apraxiakids.org. They're the ones who have the iPad grant opportunities, but they have a lot of additional information about apraxia. What is it? How do you treat it? So I would strongly recommend any curious parents to take a look at their website as well. Another question I'm oftentimes asked is, will my child ever learn to talk? This is one of the most challenging questions to answer, I think, and it's of course difficult if I haven't met the child. But in general, I tell parents there really is no set age cutoff for learning how to talk. I think that's a common misconception. Sometimes parents will come to me and say, you know, well, my speech therapist told me if my child isn't talking by 3, they're never going to talk, or sometimes it's 6. And there really aren't any hard and fast rules. When it comes to HIVEP2, we're obviously still learning a lot more about it. We heard from families in the beginning that many children are talking, whether that's single words or phrases or sentences. It certainly, I think, is a possibility for kids if your child's not talking now. It's certainly a possibility in the future. I would recommend to parents, regardless of whether or not they're using some words or not, AAC strategies might still be helpful. If you remember, AAC strategies, they're not just used for kids who are nonverbal, they're used for any child who maybe speech isn't sufficient in all situations. So I would certainly keep an open mind. I would implement things that are going to help your child functionally communicate now, regardless of whether or not they're going to eventually become verbal communicators. It's important that they have some type of strategies in place. You can start teaching them language skills that speech can then scaffold onto. Some final thoughts, and I think I'm running over, so I'm going to be pretty quick with this. There's no one-size-fits-all strategy. Something that works for one child isn't necessarily going to work for another, and that's why it's so important to have a comprehensive assessment. The second is that communication is multimodal. So there's no reason why you have to settle on just one AAC strategy. It's really going to depend on the situation and the individual child. Most kids that I work with do use more than one strategy. Maybe speech works some of the time, especially if your family understands you, but then maybe you go out in the community and you use another strategy as a supplement. You certainly want to keep the lines of communication open between families, teachers, and therapists. You really have to have buy-in from everyone who works with the child for these strategies to be used appropriately. And then the strategy is only as effective as the instruction program. So every strategy I talked about today, it's not enough to simply show the child how to use it once or twice. It's going to be an ongoing learning process, both for the child as well as for the family and the school team. So it's something that a child is going to continue to learn over time, the same way a child continues to learn language over the time. And so because of that, of course, some time and commitment are going to be required on the part of the family and the school. These are some additional resources if you want any more information about PECS or POD. I've included those there. The Apps for AAC website is really great if you're considering getting some type of a communication app for the iPad. And then if you have an iPad but you would like to use it for communication, the iPad Pinterest site that's listed there has some nice cases and covers and accessories that are things to keep in mind for individuals who might use the iPad as a communication device. Okay, that's the end of my presentation.